Will eating 1 can a day of sardines be enough to raise your omega-3s? Will that small amount of seafood improve your EPA and DHA levels and your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio? Well, today we're going to find out. A couple of months ago, I ran an OmegaCheck on myself to just get an idea of what my omega-3s were, my omega-6s, and all that kind of stuff. At that time, I only consumed fish maybe once a month. Most of the time I was eating beef, butter, bacon, and eggs. Also, probably about 90% of my diet is conventionally raised meat. I don't do a ton of grass-fed, grass-finished products. I mean, I'll get a butcher box probably once every couple of months, and in that will be some grass-fed, grass-finished stuff, so I'll throw that in. But most of the time, I'm getting my meat from Jewel or Costco. In the blood work video where I discussed these original OmegaCheck results, I said that I was going to start consuming 1 can of sardines per day to see if that would make much of a difference. I wanted to see if a small amount of a food would do the trick before I started adding in supplements. In general, I like to get everything I need from whole, real food sources before I start, adding in the supplements. I'm not opposed to supplements, but I just like to try to get it from a food first. And since sardines are an animal, I was able to include them on my carnivore diet. So here we are 2 months later, and I've retested my OmegaCheck after consuming 1 can of sardines per day on average for the past 2 months. I kept everything else the same. I just threw in a can of sardines per day. There were some days that I missed, but I did do a couple of sardine fasts in this period of time. So on average, I consumed 1 can of sardines per day for that 2-month period. On the day that I took my second OmegaCheck, I was on day 3 of a 3-day sardine fast. Before we dive into my first OmegaCheck, if you are looking to share your love of the carnivore diet, head over to jennymitich.shop and check out all of my carnivore diet themed apparel, including this carnivore dictionary definition t-shirt. Now let's dive into my first OmegaCheck results that I got before starting this experiment. I got this run on July 3rd, 2024. First off, here's my OmegaCheck. This is a 3.3. This is basically saying that I am at a high relative risk of a sudden cardiovascular event, which sounds very scary, but we'll dive into that here in a moment. Just know that the OmegaCheck being a 3.3, that would be considered pretty low, like my omega-3s are pretty low. The next ratio is the arachidonic acid to EPA ratio, and I came in at a 57.3, which is considered high. My omega-6 to omega-3 ratio was a 13.3. My omega-3 total was 3.3. My EPA was a 0.3, which is considered low. My DPA was a 0.9. My DHA was a 2.2, which is kind of like a low normal. My omega-6 total was 44.3. My arachidonic acid, which was one of the omega-6s that they measure, was a 15.5. That would be kind of like a high normal. And the other omega-6 that is measured in this test is linoleic acid, and that came in at 26, which is also a high normal. So let's talk about these a little bit. First of all, let's talk about the OmegaCheck, the very first number, the 3.3, saying that I'm at a high risk for, a sudden cardiovascular event. This is not meant to scare you or make you think that you're going to have a heart attack like tomorrow or anything like that. All it's saying is that relative risk-wise, you may be at a higher risk of having a cardiovascular event because you have many more omega-6s than omega-3s. That's all that's saying. There's so many other things that go into it, diet, lifestyle, do you smoke, do you drink, genetic factors, so many other things. So when we're taking a look at all of my other blood tests that I had done at that same time, because I didn't just run the OmegaCheck, my triglycerides were 43, my A1C 5.3, my GGT, which is a liver function number, was an 8. You want that to be really low, so that was really good. My fasting insulin was a 6.7, a little tiny bit higher than it normally is, but that's still really good. And my HDL was an 80. So within the context of all of my other blood work, I really wasn't super worried about having a sudden heart attack. So just take that with a grain of salt if you decide to run this test for yourself. All this test told me was that I probably needed to up my consumption of omega-3s. I was definitely getting enough omega-6s, and you don't want to not get any omega-6s. You're going to be consuming some in your diet. It's just you want to have a balance. So my EPA being at a 0.3, that's what was throwing off my arachidonic acid to EPA ratio because it was so very low. And my arachidonic acid being a 15.5, 25, and my linoleic acid being at 26, still in the normal range, but a little bit high. That's not really surprising to me. I'm eating a lot of conventionally raised beef. There's going to be a little bit more omega-6, in that. It's not a huge difference, but it would be interesting to do an experiment where I ran this same test, but instead switched over to grass-fed, grass-finished meat exclusively for a month or two to see if that made a difference with the omega-6s. That was what inspired me to do this can of sardines a day, keep the doctor away kind of thing. So before we dive into my retesting, I would like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Element Electrolytes. When you're doing any kind of fasting, like a water fast or a sardine fast or anything like that, you really want to stay hydrated. So whenever I do a sardine fast, I'm always doing some Element Electrolytes along with it. I personally do either their raw unflavored packets or I do their sparkling waters, both of which are free of maltodextrin and excellent choices on a carnivore diet. Right now, Element is offering my viewers a free sample pack with any order, so you could get some of the raw unflavored packets, you could get some of the sparkling waters, a mix of the two, whatever you want, and you can get a free sample pack with that order. Just head over to the link in the description. It's drinkelement.com/Jenny Mitich. That's DRINKLMNT.com/Jenny Mitich and get your free sample pack with any order today. All right, let's dive into my second OmegaCheck so we can see the results of eating 1 can of sardines per day on average for the past 2 months. First off is the OmegaCheck. It came in at an 8.6, which would be considered normal, and it was up from a 3.3. So now I'm considered to be at a low relative risk of a sudden cardiovascular event. Next up, the arachidonic acid to EPA ratio was a 4.9, down from a 57.3. My omega-6 to omega-3 ratio was a 4.3, which is down from a 13.3. My total omega-3s were an 8.6, which was up from a 3.3. My EPA had a big jump. It was a 2.8, which was up from 0.3. My DPA stayed the same at 0.9. My DHA also jumped up drastically to a 4.9 from a 2.2. My total omega-6s went down a little bit, 37.1, which was down from 44.3. My arachidonic acid also declined to a 13.8, down from a 15.5. And finally, my linoleic acid also declined a bit to 21.4, down from a 26. So again, that relative risk of the OmegaCheck in the beginning that, now I'm not going to have a heart attack. That's why I'm saying, you need to look at all of your blood work in context. If you were just going to get an OmegaCheck and you didn't know anything else, you might be like, oh my God, blah. But take it again with a grain of salt. It's not going to tell you you're going to die tomorrow. So apparently now I'm good. The relative risk is low because I've adjusted my omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. You can see that huge drop in the arachidonic acid to EPA ratio down to a 4.9 from a 57.3. And the only reason that was adjusted, I only had a very small decrease in my arachidonic acid, maybe down like a 1.5, but the large increase in my EPA up to 2.8 from a 0.3, that's what really swayed that ratio. If you look at the results on the OmegaCheck, my EPA was up to a 2.8 and they considered that high, which I would think more in like functional medicine terms. I like to be at the high ranges, like the upper quadrant of all these reference ranges. So I would consider that to be good. And my DHA also going up, that was still considered normal. So that makes sense. I was consuming a lot more fish. And granted, a can of sardines per day, it's only, 3 ounces maybe, but that seemed to be enough to really make a difference. Because I did not change anything else in my diet. I was still eating the beef, butter, bacon, and eggs, but throwing in those sardines, it did something. So what are the takeaways from this experiment? Number 1, eating a can of sardines per day can improve your EPA, your DHA, and your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. Number 2, it doesn't necessarily have to be, a can of sardines per day. It doesn't have to be every day. Like I said, I averaged a can of sardines per day for that 2-month period. There were some, times when I didn't eat any sardines for a week, but then I went into like a 3-day sardine fast where I had 6 cans in a day, so it evened out. I think you could probably get away with consuming some kind of seafood product 3 to 4 days per week, very small servings, and get the same results. Number 3, if you hate sardines, you could probably do this with other canned or fresh seafood, including mackerel, salmon, tuna, anchovies, or whatever kind of fish you enjoy. The great thing about sardines is they're extra fatty, and they also, I always get the bone-in ones, so they have some added, calcium and things like that that I'm not getting from a lot of other sources. They also have a pretty good amount of protein. And the final thing I love about sardines is they're a small fish and they're very short-lived, so they don't have a lot of time to accumulate the mercury levels that you will see in the larger fish. If you'd like to test your omega-3s and omega-6s, you can do this blood test for yourself in 45 out of 50 states in the United States. This test is called the OmegaCheck. It's currently $61 on ownyourlabs.com, and you can use the code Jenny Mitich to get an additional 10% off of your blood work order. That is not an affiliate link. I don't get anything for that. That is a code that I got for you guys because I think that knowing your numbers is important, and I wanted to get you some savings. I'll put a link to the OmegaCheck in the description below along with that coupon code. On the screen, I'm going to put a link to my sardine fast results video. In this video, I talk about my results from several sardine fasts and the weight loss that I experienced. I'll also put a couple of links to my favorite sardines in the description below. I know sardines can be kind of like an acquired taste, but I found some that are actually quite good over at World Market, so I will link those all in the description below if you'd like to check those out. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.